Hey everyone, Dave here, and welcome to the final Tolkien Adaptation Month. Tolkien Adaptation Month 3, Return of the Thing. I'm glad you are here with me, here at the end of this annual tradition of celebrating 20 years of the Peter Jackson movies. In year 1, I counted down my least favorite changes Jackson made to the trilogy. In year 2, I counted down my favorite changes. And now, in our third and final year, I'm counting down changes Jackson didn't make to the trilogy, but almost did. Yes, today I'm counting down all the ways I've heard Jackson and his team were considering changing the story when they adapted Lord of the Rings. In some cases, these changes didn't happen because they thought better of it. In some cases, they were just cut for time. But all of them would have altered the narrative of the films, even if only subtly. And I'm counting down to the changes that I think would be most interesting. Not necessarily that would have been the best or worst changes they could have made, but just the ones that I really want to unpack just how they would have affected the rest of the story. So let's get counted. Number 10, the arrival in Minas Tirith. So, you know the scene where Gandalf and Pippin first arrive in Minas Tirith? And you know the scene later on where Faramir's Rangers of Ithilien are overwhelmed by orcs and Nazgul and they retreat back to Minas Tirith? At one point, these were going to be the same scene.
So this was a sequence that we had a little bit of trouble because we've put it in a completely different place to where it was shot. If you remember when Gandalf and Pippin arrive at Minas Tirith for the very first time and they get to the brow of the hill and stop and they look at the city, what was going to happen was that they were going to see this retreat and then they were going to go and intervene before they even had gone into the city. But we've now put the sequence much later and we've had Gandalf actually leaving from the gates of the city itself.
And a remnant of this idea is in the movie, namely the fact that Pippin is on Shadowfax with Gandalf, even though there's really no reason to bring Pippin out for this. It's just because originally, when this was shot, they were supposed to be first arriving together. That's why Pippin's there. It's not just that Gandalf is endangering him for no reason, just for kicks.
Throw yourself in next time and rid us of your stupidity.
Number 9, Éowyn delivers a baby. Now in the book, Éowyn and the citizens of Rohan were safely elsewhere while Helm's Deep was being attacked. Jackson already changed the story by having them be in Helm's Deep during the battle in order to increase the human stakes of the fight, but they almost went even further with it.
There was footage shot of an additional storyline of Éowyn helping the Rohan woman Morwen through a birth. Éowyn delivers the baby, and in one version they have to stay behind to deliver the baby while the rest of the refugees flee out the secret passage.
I get why things like this get cut when you're making transfer time, and you know, it might have been hat on a hat to have just peril upon peril upon peril to the most innocent of people, but frankly, I think they should have kept this in, but only had it going on in the background like Abed in that one Community episode.
What have you been up to?
Not much.
Number 8, one last Uruk-hai attack. At one point at the end of Fellowship, instead of the heartfelt moment between Frodo and Sam, there was gonna be another fight scene.
When you thought they had escaped and the boat was out in the middle of the lake, Uruk-hai came up from under the boat, reached up and pulled Frodo out of the boat.
In the struggle, the ring slips off of Frodo's neck and somehow, gets down in the water, and the Uruk, captivated by the ring, goes for it and is so obsessed with it that he actually drowns himself.
I guess the ring's power works even faster on Uruks.
And Sam is able to whack the Uruk and somehow get Frodo out of the water. But it was in the ring as well.
There's things I like about this idea. I like how it foreshadows Gollum's eventual demise, and by and large, I've praised Jackson's amping up of the urgency through action sequences, and in this case, I get the instinct, I really do. But I'm glad they thought better of it.
I made a promise, Mr. Frodo. A promise. Don't you leave him, Samwise Gamgee.
This scene is perfect. It doesn't need to be complicated with additional peril. Number 7, Changes to Lothlorien. Shortly after the Fellowship arrives in Lothlorien, there's a moment in the book that's cut from the film where they're sleeping in the trees, and some orcs pass underneath them, looking for them, and Gollum's there too. The elves are perplexed by Gollum, but they lure the orcs into the woods, where the orcs will be lost until elf reinforcements take care of them. This scene was cut altogether, but a variant of it was almost included, and true to Jackson's increasing of urgency, it became much more of an action sequence.
Originally, the scene where the Fellowship flee into the woods of Lothlorien, they were actually being chased by a whole lot of Moria orcs. They're hurrying through the woods and the orcs are catching up on them, and suddenly there's this volley of arrows from out of the depths of the forest that take down all the orcs.
Apparently some of the scene was actually shot, but I don't know if that footage is available anywhere. The extended edition DVD has the animatic of the scene, though. I don't have any particularly strong feelings about this change because I don't think an action sequence here would have ruined the film, but as is, the melancholy tone of Gandalf's passing flows pretty organically into the melancholy tone of Lorien as a whole, and breaking that up with an action beat might have been a little jarring, possibly. So I'm neither sad nor glad they didn't go with this change. But an earlier potential change I am glad they didn't go with is cutting Lothlorien altogether. Yes, infamously, when this was being developed at Miramax, they wanted to cut it to 2 movies, which would have meant cutting even more of the story than they ended up cutting. And if that had been the case, Galadriel would have gone the way of Tom Bombadil.
I will diminish.
Look, for all my complaints about the portrayal of the elves in these movies, the solution to that problem would not have been get rid of some of the most important elves, so I'm glad this change did not happen. Number 6. Faramir sees Frodo Gollum. So at one point, when Faramir was looking at Frodo, he was going to see a flash of what the ring could do to him.
We were going to have this moment where you actually get a glimpse, in a sense Faramir gets a glimpse of what Frodo would become if he held onto the ring, and also for Faramir what the ring is capable of doing to someone.
And this didn't make it into the film, but it was shot, and a lot of work was put in to make the shot possible.
It was Gino Acevedo that applied the makeup. It was cool because I didn't actually have any major makeup for the movie except for the wig and the ears, so it was great fun to sort of physically transform for that moment.
It is a shame that there was so much effort put into something that ended up on the cutting room floor, but I really think this just would have confused the Faramir scenes even further. Faramir gets a glimpse of what the ring does to someone who tries to wield it, and his immediate thought is, yeah, using this will win my dad's love.
It was an interesting point in the journey because it was a moment that placed a seed of doubt in Faramir's mind as to whether to take this ring or not.
Come on, this is the character Tolkien said was most like him. Number 5. The crew doesn't return to Isengard. When they were restructuring the plot points to fit the 3 books into 3 movies, they weren't sure how they were going to fit the return to Isengard in after Helm's Deep. And at one point, they just considered skipping it.
You know, if you were returning to Isengard at the end of the 2 towers, and you obviously had to have the scene in its entirety, which was upwards of 10 minutes long, and it was just a very anticlimactic way to end that movie after you've had the huge battle. And for a long time, the thinking was, well, is there a way that we don't have them return to Isengard? Can they pick up the Palantir somewhere else?
I don't know if they thought through everything that would have to change when they considered that. I don't know if they had an idea of where else Merry and Pippin would reunite with Aragorn. I don't know if they had an idea of where else they would pick up the Palantir. I don't know if they had an idea of how else Saruman would be disposed of, but at one point, even if only briefly, they thought that eliminating this trip to Isengard would be easier than fitting it into either the end of the 2 towers or the beginning of Return of the King.
They're taking the hobbits to Isengard!
But we don't want to go there. Let's just meet them when they get back.
Number 4. Aragorn versus Sauron. This is one that I get why it made sense on paper, but I'm really glad they didn't go with it.
And we also felt that Aragorn has come this distance with his journey and that Sauron is his enemy, and that we had to somehow have this personal duel between Aragorn and Sauron. And that's not in the book, but we felt that it had to be in the movie.
The moment where Aragorn is dismounted and they're all standing there vastly outnumbered, and this blinding bright light shines on us, which blinds everyone except Aragorn at a certain moment sees something and walks toward it.
it was Anatar, which is a representation of Sauron as he is in his true angelic form. Then the angelic figure suddenly turns into Sauron and attacks Aragorn.
There are already too many confusing questions about the nature of Sauron in these movies. Having him actually manifest in person would have just raised even more questions, on top of being thematically unnecessary to have Aragorn face down against him when the real battle is in Mount Doom.
Sauron no longer has a physical presence at this point in the novels, and he cannot emerge from his tower. I mean, his tower is his body. The tower is the embodiment of whatever it is of Sauron that actually remains in Middle-earth. And I thought that to bring him back out in physical form would just be, a major concession.
But since the scene was shot with intention of doing this, there are a few remnants of it in the final cut.
I thought that, all this bright light footage that we have of looking and reacting to the light, that there was no way we could use that. But then it was actually Viggo himself that said to me, we could use some of that footage if we had the idea that the eye flares out. It's almost like it's beaming in on Aragorn. It's psychically affecting him.
And since Aragorn had to fight someone big, he's fighting a cave troll. Which is a nice way to show how things have escalated since the first movie, I guess. Originally, all 9 of them were struggling against one of them. Now it's just Aragorn versus one, while everyone else is fighting other bad guys. Number 3. Gandalf giving up smoking. John Ronald Reuel Tolkien was a big fan of tobacco, and he wanted his characters to enjoy smoking a pipe just as he did. But since tobacco was discovered in North America, he needed a different tobacco-like substance for his characters to enjoy. So he invented pipeweed, a plant that the citizens of Middle-earth smoke in a pipe that is basically tobacco except native to pre-Europe. Then as marijuana weed got more popular, the jokes about, the habits are smoking weed, man, started early and never ever stopped. The movies play it ambiguously as to whether pipeweed is more tobacco weed or weed, but the actors made their choices.
Billy and Dom gave us a lot of variations in just how stoned they were, and there were some actually quite funny ones where they were incredibly stoned.
But as smoking tobacco had become significantly less socially acceptable, the filmmakers had to wrestle with how they would handle the copious smoking in the books, and at one point they considered having Gandalf actively give up smoking.
There was an idea of Fran Walsh, or was it Philippa Burns, that Gandalf should have just given up smoking. I think they were a little bit worried that New Line or the censors or people who don't like smokers were going to object to the number of characters who smoke in the movie.
It's probably for the best that they didn't do this. It would not have been a popular change, drawing attention to modern sensibilities regarding smoking in a fantasy world. Save that for modern sensibilities about skateboarding. That said, changing the text to reflect how the outside world has changed would be interesting given the larger themes. The very first line of English we hear in the movie is, "The world is changed," and this would have reflected that on a meta level.
It was acknowledging that the world's moved on a little bit since the books were written.
But if they had to update for modern smoking sensibilities, let's be real, the better move would have been to just not acknowledge smoking at all. But of course, if they did that, they wouldn't have been able to set up all the Sharky business they had no intention of paying off.
Longbottom leaf. The finest pipeweed in the South Farthing.
So ultimately, the characters do smoke in the film, just like they do in the book. But once again, there exists one remnant of this idea in the final trilogy, one pretty confusing remnant. Gandalf doesn't quit smoking, but he does very briefly react poorly to it.
We do, for those who are rabidly anti-smoking, put in enough anti-smoking propaganda, and one of them is the catch in the throat that Gandalf has during the scene with Pippin. And water has to be brought, and we integrated it into the scene as if Pippin didn't quite approve of the rate at which Gandalf smoked.
So, compromise. Everyone still smokes, but one person in exactly one instance doesn't feel good doing it. Those who hate smoking still aren't happy, and those who don't care are confused. Look, I really do love these movies. There are just some parts you can't really zoom in too close on. Number 2. Sam and Rosie's officiant. You notice there's no officiant at Sam and Rosie's wedding? They seem to have just married themselves. Well, there almost was an officiant. The idea was discussed of it being an artist cameo.
One question that Pete was asked was, well, should there be a minister? But one idea that was knocked around was that Alan Lee would do a cameo as the minister.
Of course, that's not the part that would have been a change from the book. The part that would have been a change is that the artist cameo would have been playing a character cameo.
There was even talk that he would be this sort of, he would be Tom Bombadil as the minister.
Yep. They seriously almost had an unspeaking Tom Bombadil officiate Sam and Rosie's wedding. Some of these changes I'm glad they thought better of, but this they should have done. This would have been the most hilarious meta punchline to all the should they cut Bombadil debate.
We don't know that they didn't go into the Old Forest. We don't know that they didn't meet Tom.
In fact, they bonded with Tom so much off camera that Sam asked him to officiate his wedding. Roll with it. And the number one change that almost was made to the Lord of the Rings movies. A lot more characters were at Helm's Deep in the movie than in the book. I mentioned earlier Jackson moved the innocent citizens of Rohan there, and we talked last year about the elves coming for reinforcements. But there is one elf who isn't there in the final cut of the film, who was there in earlier development. And if you have followed any of the behind-the-scenes info of these movies, you know where I'm going with this. Arwen at Helm's Deep. This is probably the most notorious change that almost happened, and it's certainly the one that fascinates me most because I'm really curious how it would have shaped the rest of the movie. The movie already plays up the Aragorn, Arwen, Éowyn love triangle way more than the book does, but in the final cut, so much of the way it's played is based on the fact that Éowyn is here and Arwen is not.
We had a romance where the two characters, Aragorn and Arwen, weren't in the two towers. They weren't in the same space. You know, they were in two completely different places in Middle-earth.
How would that entire thread have changed if Arwen was there? How would it have changed Arwen's subplot about going to the Grey Havens? I have no idea. I've never been able to find a shooting script of this version of the movie. I don't even know if there was one. It's possible that they never finished a complete draft because they wrote Arwen out of Helm's Deep when they realized they couldn't make the rest of the story work.
And as we're shooting Helm's Deep, a decision was made, look, you know what? Actually, this isn't working. We need to change this.
I mean, I know there's the rumor that the reason they changed this is because when it leaked that this was happening, the backlash was so loud they couldn't ignore it, but I don't know.
And certainly we got a lot of fan reaction to that. There was a rumor on the net that went out immediately that was the direction the movie was going to go. And there were a lot of objections to that thought.
People don't think that we ever look at this stuff, and I once made the mistake of going and reading some of the stuff, and I cried so hard afterwards.
What I do know is that this wasn't the only place they considered increasing Arwen's presence in the story.
We had the broken sword at Rivendell. We had it obviously being reforged at this particular point in time, and then the question became, how does Aragorn actually get it? And we really just needed a courier to deliver the sword, and I know that we debated whether it should be Arwen a long time ago.
But I do think having Arwen at Helm's Deep would have had the potential to be interesting. Not only would it have kept her portrayal throughout the trilogy a little more consistent with her introduction, but it would have been pretty powerful to have her actually confront mortality for the first time in Helm's Deep and still choose it in the end. On the other hand, it could have just led to love triangle shenanigans with the jealous Éowyn. I don't know. But it still wouldn't have been the worst character assassination in the movie.
The ring will go to Gondor.
I swear, in the book, Faramir and Éowyn make sense together because resisting the ring and destroying the Witch King are the two most badass things any humans have ever done. But here, dude, she is way out of your league.
And those are the most interesting changes I've heard about Peter Jackson and his team considering making to Lord of the Rings. Were there any big ones I missed? Let me know in the comments. And let me know what you think about these changes. Should they have stuck with some of these ideas? Would any of them have been deal breakers? As for me, I have the ones I prefer and the ones I don't, but I don't know if any would have been deal breakers because, like I've said before, despite any issues I have with some of the changes they did make, with everything that had to go into this production, it's a miracle the movies are watchable, let alone masterpieces, and it's hard to imagine how futzing with the lightning in a bottle would have changed things. But then that's been a large part of why I do this every year, to explore other takes on Tolkien, how different choices made by adapters affect the story in different ways. Over the last 2 years, I've reviewed every filmed and televised Tolkien adaptation I could find, and frankly, there were so many different takes, so many different styles and adaptational choices that the movies were all distinct enough that they barely invite comparison. But next week, we'll be getting into some adaptations that have a little more overlap. Until then, let's discuss everything we've talked about so far in the comments, and this is Dave, signing off.